Okay, so it's right around 2 o'clock. We've got a lot of information to share, so I'm going to get started. Again, I'm Lainey Castle with the Public Programs Office at ALA. Welcome to the webinar. I wanted to share a couple of announcements before we go into our presentation part of the webinar. Today, only our presenters have camera and microphone access. So to communicate in the classroom, you can use the Q&A and the chat features available in Zoom. If you would please direct any technical questions to Brian Russell. He's on ALA's staff and he's running tech today. By sending a chat message to him directly, you can select Public Programs Office from the To area dropdown in the chat to contact him. You can also use the chat feature as you have been doing to further introduce yourselves, share ideas, share links, or any questions for other attendees that may come to mind during the session. During the presentation of the webinar, that's going to last for about an hour. Our presenters are going to stay with us in the classroom to take questions for about 10 or 15 minutes afterward. You can submit your questions for presenters at any time during the presentation. ALA staff will review and moderate when the Q&A period begins. Please do use the Q&A feature in order to send those questions so that we can queue them up and moderate them for you. And finally, a note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available along with all of the slides in the presentations later today through programminglibrarian.org, our website. We will send that link out along with a link to a short survey later this afternoon. So with that, welcome. I'm excited to have so many people joining us today to learn more about how the freely available and very carefully curated resources for the Great Stories Club might be of use to your library, your community, or maybe just your group of family or friends. During the hour that we have together today, we're going to cover a few different topics. First, I'm going to spend about 5 minutes sharing information about the ALA Great Stories Club model and pointing out where you can find resources from the program to use in your own book club programs, whatever format they'll take and whoever your audience might be. Then we'll hear from Amber Hayes with ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services about their mission and its connection to the Great Stories Club program, and as well as some resources that might be useful to librarians and library workers who are engaging in EDI, literacy, and outreach work. Next, our Great Stories Club literature scholar, Susanna Morris, will spend about half an hour speaking with us about the ideas and the books in the Great Stories Club series that we're going to focus on today, which is Finding Your Voice, Speaking Truth to Power. And finally, Library Book Club leader Anne Schilling will share her experiences convening a virtual book club and offer some tips for anyone interested in engaging with teen readers or other readers in a meaningful way, even as libraries are adjusting to COVID-19 related closures and restrictions. Again, feel free to submit questions for presenters anytime through Q&A. We do have a high number of registrants for this session, so if your question is not answered, or if you need to disconnect before Q&A, please reach out to our staff at publicprograms.ala.org. We would love to hear from you and we'd be happy to help you. The Great Stories Club is a long-running reading and discussion program model that provides libraries with thematically related collections of books for young adult readers, humanities-based discussion questions, a small cash grant, and a wide range of additional support for book club implementation. The project was developed with the goal of bringing excellent literary programming to young adults who might otherwise lack access. Library outreach partnerships are at the heart of the Great Stories Club program, and they focus on connecting libraries with underserved teens, especially those in alternative schools, alternative education settings, and juvenile detention facilities. There's a lot more information about the project on ALA's website, both about the history and to support libraries in replicating the program model. Among other things, we have a how-to programming guide, a full range of materials for 9 different thematic series. Grants are not available at this time. However, future opportunities to apply for funding would be posted on our website. Our webinar today, as I mentioned, focuses on the series Finding Your Voice, Speaking Truth to Power, which was developed to support the WK Kellogg Foundation's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation initiative. Finding Your Voice was developed in 2018, hosted in libraries in 2019, and would not have been possible without funding from the Kellogg Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, or without the leadership of our national implementation team members who are pictured on screen now, who did fantastic work curating the content that we're going to introduce you to today. Many thanks to our funders and our project advisors. I would also like to thank ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services and their incredible staff for being an invaluable partner to this project. To talk a little bit about their mission and how it intersects with our work together on the Great Stories Club, I'm happy to introduce Amber Hayes, Outreach and Communications Program Officer with the ALA Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. Amber?
Thanks, Lainey. So ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, or OTLOS as we call it, supports library and information science workers in creating responsible and all-inclusive spaces that serve and represent the entire community. Our office plays a central role in leading efforts around equity, diversity, inclusion, literacy, outreach, retention, and recruitment through a social justice lens. To accomplish this, we decenter power and privilege by facilitating conversations around access and identity as they impact the profession and those we serve. We use a social justice framework to inform library and information science workers' development of resources, and we strive to create an association culture where these concerns are everyone's everyday work. While none of these areas can or should be delegated to just one office, it's through this intersection with social justice that our office, OTLOS, provides leadership, education, and consultation. Her work includes various continuing education opportunities, Spectrum Scholarship Program, and various resources. Our latest resources include Libraries Respond, Black Lives Matter, and Libraries Respond, Protecting Transgender Staff and Patrons. The Spectrum Scholarship Program supports American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black African American, Hispanic Latino, Middle Eastern and North African, and/or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students to assist them with obtaining a graduate degree in leadership positions within the profession and within ALA. The American Library Association strives to provide leadership for the development, promotion, and improvement of the library and information services and the profession of librarianship in order to enhance learning and ensure access to information for all. ALA recognizes that equity, diversity, inclusion should be included in this, and we have the 4th strategic direction to accomplish this goal. The EDI strategic direction includes 7 goals, several of which Great Stories Club helps meet. 2 that especially resonate include established resources and support so libraries and librarians can be effective advocates for the inclusion of all individuals in the life of their community, and provide safe, respectful space for diverse voices and perspectives. We hope that you continue to have these important and meaningful conversations with your patrons and fellow LIS professionals. If you'd like to learn more, please visit us at ala.org/diversity. And with that, I turn it back over to Lainey. Thank you all.
Thank you, Amber. While Finding Your Voice was developed to use as part of the Great Stories Club program, the collection of books that are included and shown on screen here and the questions that the books present are relevant to most readers over the age of 14. So these books have the potential to use with teen book clubs, adult reading groups, or intergenerational gatherings. Over the next hour, I'll share information about where to find resources, and our speakers will talk with you about how to frame the humanities content of the curated 6-book series and how to host a book club in a virtual environment. The ALA Great Stories Club web pages are all available at ala.org/greatstories. There's one section that is especially relevant to today's presentation. If you go in the lower right-hand corner to download free resources, click on that, and then you'll see an icon for Finding Your Voice. Through that page, ALA provides free access to everything that you need to convene a reading and discussion series. First, the site includes the 6-book list and an essay that frames the Finding Your Voice series written by our humanities scholar, Susanna, who you'll hear from in a minute. This essay was created for use by library book club leaders and intended to convey the vision for the series, noting connections to relevant humanities scholarship. It's also an excellent tool for older teens as well as adult readers. The thematic essay is available as a print-ready PDF for your use, and it's previewed on screen here. Book-specific discussion questions are also available, designed and ready to distribute. Each book in the series has 5 multi-part questions that are ready to go or ready to inspire you to write your own questions. We also provide a PDF that includes 3 multi-part discussion questions that you can use right away to convene conversations with any one of the 6 books in the series. Like the other resources, these questions have a graphic design element. You can print and distribute them, or you can share them with readers electronically. On screen is a preview of one question, which, as you can see, has multiple parts that works with all 6 books. The site also provides reproducible promotional materials. We have customizable posters, bookmarks for each book in the series. One example is shown here, web banners and logos. There's also an annotated related reading list of other YA books that might be used to continue exploring the Finding Your Voice theme and questions. The last area of supporting content that I want to draw everyone's attention to is at the bottom of our webpage. It's under the See Also heading. From there, go to Resources Compiled to Support Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, or TRHT. There you will find the TRHT glossary. This is reproduced on ALA's website with permission from the WK Kellogg Foundation, and it might be useful in offering a common vocabulary to your book club participants. There's a short list of resources on structural racism. This is background reading that was gathered to help promote understanding of structural racism, both among the library professionals who were offering this Great Stories Club series and for their readers. This is important foundational information necessary before people can take steps to shift and dismantle structures within their own communities. We also have reading lists about race and racism that come from libraries around the country, as well as other units of ALA. Those are included here. And finally, links for those who would like to learn more about the Kellogg Foundation's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative, which supported and inspired development of this series. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Susanna Morris is Associate Professor of Literature, Media, and Communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She has worked with the Great Stories Club program since 2016 as a National Project Scholar, working with librarians to design the Finding Your Voice series, as well as another fantastic series called Growing Up Brave on the Margins. Susanna's vision and generosity have influenced this project in many ways, large and small, and I'm so grateful that she's here today to share her wonderful work on Finding Your Voice with you. Thank you, Susanna. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lainey, and many thanks to everyone at the ALA, especially Brian. It has been an honor to be a National Scholar, a Project Scholar, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much over the years, and it's been a lot of fun. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So the Finding Your Voice series, you can see the 6 books that are listed here. And basically, the series invites young readers or readers of any age to consider speaking up and speaking out and speaking truth to power. And it also is, highlighting the challenges and the possible consequences that will happen if one speaks up, but also why it's so very necessary. And I think it's, we want it to be evergreen and timeless, but I think it's particularly fitting in this particular moment, right? Next slide, please. So I was inspired to create this series by my work teaching the literature of the civil rights movement. So I've been a college professor since 2007. And for many years, I've taught a course on the literature of the civil rights movement. And in teaching it to young people, I've always been struck by the role of young people in pretty much any kind of civil agitation or unrest. And that would be something that my students would often talk about, like, oh, I didn't realize that all these folks were so young, even the people that we thought of or we think of as old, right? Like grown-ups like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, they were just in their 30s, right at the height of their careers and right before they died. So that was always something that I always wanted to focus on as I taught. And I thought, as I was invited to create this series, that young people have a particular power that's really important to focus on. And so in this series, we use discussion questions like what's listed on this particular slide here, which is in relation to Marco Shiro's novel, Anger is a Gift. And so these are the kinds of questions that get readers thinking about what it means to find your voice. And this is what I wanted to amplify in the series. Next slide, please. So we probably have all heard the old adage, children should be seen and not heard. And the phrase reflects a sort of commonplace thought about young people's place in the world, right? Maybe some of us were raised hearing that, or maybe, we even know people who think that today. But like activist Marian Wright Edelman's quote suggests, there's this other way of understanding children's place in the world, right? That children actually reflect our values in particular kinds of ways. And so if we want to have a society that's more just and more equitable, empowering young people to use their voices is really important, right? So again, this series provides some examples, some representative text that invites us to reconsider that sort of old thinking or maybe evergreen thinking, right? And it gives examples of young people taking up space and fighting for justice. Next slide, please. So there are countless examples in history, right? Here's our girl, Joan of Arc. In 1429, she was a French young woman who led armies to fight for self-determination in her community, right? She donned the armor in an era where women were considered property, right? And she led armies. This was a big deal for someone who was just 18 years old. Next slide, please. But we don't have to go all the way back to the 15th century, right? We can go to the 20th century and we can talk about someone who's still alive, Ruby Bridges. She was just 6 years old, okay, in 1960. And she was the first Black child to integrate a white Southern elementary school in New Orleans. And obviously this is a picture here of her being escorted from school by US Marshals. You can see the gentleman with the US Marshals badge. There are two of them on their arms, right? And there she is with her little attaché case, integrating a whole school in front of raging mobs, right, of segregationists. So these are examples of folks in very different ways speaking truth to power, right? Next slide, please. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the series doesn't simply show examples of folks Pollyanna-ishly speaking truth to power, right? Saying like, I'm standing up for my rights, and then they get their rights and they keep going. We know that when you speak truth to power, it's not necessarily easy. So Joan of Arc is burnt at the stake. And while she might be, memorialized now and canonized, it did not go well for her in that particular moment. Little Ruby Bridges received death threats, right? It was actually a really terrible year for her to integrate that school. Folks were staunchly against it, and it was really a hard burden to put on a 6-year-old girl. And so I include this quote by Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldua, who writes that while tongues can't be tamed, they can only be cut out. And that is what folks in power who are afraid of losing their position try to do to folks who are seeking more equitable, more just futures, right? Like a Joan of Arc or Ruby Bridges, right? So when we speak truth to institutional inequity and injustice, the consequences are real, and that's important for us to talk about as well. Like, why are there so many mechanisms in place to keep people marginalized, right? Next slide, please. So Bell Hooks, who's a Black feminist thinker and writer, speaks to this as well. She says, sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist, right? They want the status quo to remain as it is. And I think that young people, or if we're having intergenerational conversations about speaking truth to power, that this is sort of important to remember. It's not because marginalized folk are unintelligent or lack inherent power, but because their different way of thinking is threatening to sort of an existing power structure that could be problematic. Next slide, please. So as I said, I've taught the literature of the civil rights movement for many years, and these are the kinds of images that I would always show my students because, as I said, they would be particularly struck by the fact that so many people who were involved in the movement were young people, and not just young people their age, like 18 or 19 or 20, but folks who were 12 and 10 right? And so in both these pictures, we have examples of folks who wanted to live in freer and more just worlds in Birmingham, Alabama in particular in the 1960s. And for this desire, they were beaten and sprayed with water hoses and attacked by dogs and jailed and sometimes even killed children, right? And so this idea that we can make these parallels between what young people might be experiencing today, right now in 2020, alongside 1965 or 1429. Next slide, please. So this series tries to be a primer and a touchstone for today's social justice movements that, again, still have young people at the forefront. And so the reason why they have young people at the forefront is for a variety of reasons, right? As civil unrest often has, but young people are being targeted. It's not just young people speaking out and therefore interacting with larger systems, right? It's that these larger systems have already been violent towards young people. So in this slide, I have two examples. So we have Rekia Boyd, who was murdered by a stray bullet from a police officer in Chicago in 2012. She was 22. And next to her is Tamir Rice, who was murdered by a police officer in 2014. He was 12. He was playing with a toy gun. Neither of these young people were armed. They were just out in the world living, and they experienced this extrajudicial violence. And so young people I work with, whether it's in my community in Atlanta or the folks that I teach at my day job, are keenly observant of what's going on and also really afraid. And I think this series gives a way to sort of talk about the very real fear that young people are experiencing. Next slide. Thank you. So the Black Lives Matter movement is a big part of the particular civil rights movement that we would say today, right? So it was founded by 3 queer Black women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, and young people around the country and the world, even if we look at the protests that have happened in the UK and so on, have been a part of this movement, have been at the forefront. There was a great story out of Tennessee where 5 young women who did not know each other came together and organized over social media to have a Black Lives Matter protest in their community, and they are all in high school, right? So young people are using social media and other more analog forms of organizing to speak out against whether it's police brutality or vigilante violence and so on in the BLM movement. Next slide, please. Another important fight where we have young folks at the forefront and intergenerational organizing is for the fight for immigration. So whether we're talking about dreamers who were brought to the country without papers, undocumented, and who are fighting to stay in a country that they've lived in most of their lives, or folks who may be organizing with organizations like Raíces, like young people are at the forefront of rethinking what it means to be American and what does citizenship mean, right? So that's another important fight that is a part of the series as well. Next slide, please. So street harassment, sexual harassment, and the Me Too movement are important movements that young people are at the forefront of. So we probably have heard of Tarana Burke, who was the person who founded Me Too originally in 2010. Now Me Too has sort of expanded to include fights against sexual harassment in Hollywood and all sorts of industries with adults. But Burke started Me Too as a way of dealing with young folk, right, who'd come to her and said, actually, I have been the victim and the survivor of sexual harassment or sexual assault. So young people, young women in particular, have been at the forefront of the Me Too movement for many years, since its inception. And so I include this street art project that I'll talk a little bit more about in a future slide that is discussing how just moving through the streets, right? Young women, young people who are just moving from place to place, maybe going from home to school, and how the world may view their bodies, and how that's something that young people often have to think about, right? I'm just trying to get here, from here to the bus, and I'm going to have to encounter several folks honking at me or are a part of. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Thank you. Another movement that sort of overarchingly mentioned throughout many of the texts is climate change. And so this slide includes two youth activists, Mari Kopany, who's also known as Little Miss Flint, who's been advocating for clean water in Flint, Michigan for several years now, and Greta Thunberg, who's known for her massive protests that span from Europe to the United States, and she's spoken in front of the United Nations and so on, advocating for climate change. So Generation Z really has been at the forefront of inviting us to consider really more aggressive notions of taking care of the planet, right, and advocating for scientific understandings of climate change. So these are all the movements that inspire the work within the series, and sort of the questions that will hopefully prompt really interesting conversations for anybody who participates. Next slide, please. So again, these are the 6 texts overall that have inspired these questions: The Poet X, I Am Alfonso Jones, Gabi, A Girl in Pieces, Piecing You Together, American Street, and Anger is a Gift. Next slide, please. And so for the next several slides, I'm just gonna get more granular in terms of talking about the text. So on the next following slides, I've included quotes from each author, and I've sort of zoomed out a particular aspect of the text. And there are many, right, that we can sort of focus on. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions that are in the actual packets that you can download online that Lainey referred to earlier. So Gabi, A Girl in Pieces is a great epistolary novel written by Isabel Quintero. And the quote that I've included here is about zines, which is an important part of the text. All of these texts include some sort of creative aspect that the protagonists engage in, right? So it could be making poetry or collages or making zines. That also could be an activity that could be done in conversation with the text. So as I said, Gabi, A Girl in Pieces is an epistolary novel. It's a bunch of diary entries, and also letters are written and so on. Gabi is a Mexican-American teen who lives in California and is going through the most eventful senior year of high school ever. Her parents are having problems. Her best friend gets pregnant. Her other best friend eventful senior year. And so the book basically asks readers to consider, like, how do you negotiate life when the adults around you are struggling? She has a parent who is struggling with addiction. She's also in a working class family where money is tight, so she's trying to figure out her life around that. And it's really about sort of her balancing being Mexican American, being the straight A student who also wants to date and do these other things, being a supportive friend, a supportive sister. So she's dealing with all of these things. So if we go to the next slide, I show a couple examples, 3 examples of feminist zines. Gabi is a feminist. And so she creates something akin to what you see here on screen, which you can totally Google and see the sort of inside of these zines. So a zine basically short for a magazine. And if you want to be analog about it, you can create something on actual paper and photocopy it and hand it out. And your zine could be on anything. So if you really love you know, poetry, you can make a zine about poetry and include your own poetry or solicit poetry from your classmates or whomever, and y'all can just type that up or write it out, photocopy it, and hand it out to folks really cheaply. So as the previous slide noted, it could be a really subversive form of publishing, right? Because you don't really need permission. You just need access to this kind of basic stuff. And obviously you can also make a zine online, right? And PDF it and share it that way. So zines have been a way for feminist communities, riot girl communities, queer communities to disseminate information, share knowledge and things of that nature without larger power structure. So it's also a great way for young readers and young people to share their thoughts, right? Next slide, please. So piecing me together also involves art, right? Piecing Me Together refers to our protagonist Jade's idea of piecing herself together, the parts of her identity, but also she's a collage artist, so it has a double meaning. The quote that I included is from author Renee Watson, who talks about what it means to be a young person and folks underestimating your intelligence and what you understand and perceive. And that's also a theme that's at the core of this text as well, right? Where Jade is underestimated. So she's a young woman, Black woman, who's growing up in Portland, Oregon. And the text weaves in Jade's experience of being a working class girl and going to this very fancy prep school and sort of her fish out of water experience there, but also she's thriving. She's academically really doing well and she loves to learn. So there's that aspect, but she's also involved in a mentorship program where she feels like she's being condescended to. There's a little bit of paternalism there where folks are like, poor Jade, she is a working class girl. She's a chubby girl. She's dark skinned, woe is her. And she doesn't really feel bad about herself. She wants resources, but she doesn't want to be talked down to or looked down upon. There's also this other thread of the story in which we're learning about the Black history of Portland, Oregon, and Oregon has a particularly unfortunate past when it comes to racism, right? And so it's also an interesting moment to be talking about this text when we see what's been happening in the news around Portland as well. So I think it would be really resonant in that way. So some of the things that Piecing Me Together invites us to consider is around collage art. So if we go to the next slide, please. We see an example of collage art by Mickalene Thomas, who is an African-American collage artist. And this is an example of one of her pieces, which centers R&B singer Solange Knowles. And she's on a bed of all these different fabrics. And I included this because it reminds me of how Jade's work is discussed in the novel, right? It's discussed as really interesting. She finds different pieces of, just objects around, and she pieces them together to create something new, right? So there are lots of different points of entry for this book. You could talk about region, talk about collage art, mentorship, advocating for herself. There's a great story of Jade wanting to study abroad. She loves learning Spanish, and folks sort of not necessarily listening to how important the study of Spanish is for her, and her having to stand up for herself to say, actually, this is something that's really important to me, and I want to fight for my rights. Right? Next slide, please. So I Am Alfonso Jones is a beautifully rendered graphic novel that is what author Tony Medina describes as a Black Lives Matter book, even though the phrase is not really used throughout, but it's definitely reflective of this moment in terms of activism. And so, as is probably apparent on the cover, because we have a young person crying and holding a picture, Alfonso Jones actually, he's a character, our protagonist dies early on in the text. He is murdered at a department store holding a hanger that is mistaken for a gun, and a police officer kills him. And so he spends most of the novel actually in the afterlife, and he's traveling with other souls that have been killed extrajudiciously. So if we go to the next slide, please. There are some examples of folks who have, experienced that. So Eleanor Bumpers was murdered in the 1980s during a raid on her apartment. Latasha Harlins, who was murdered in a grocery store in the early 90s. Her death actually precedes Rodney King's murder and really galvanized the community. And then Amadou Diallo, who was murdered in 1999 when his wallet was mistaken for a gun, right? And he was shot numerous times. And so the text sort of contextualizes Alfonso's death in this larger history of police brutality and vigilante violence. The other thing that the text does is it really shows the aftermath of what happens to a family, a community, a school, when a loved person in their family or their community or their school is murdered, right? And so I think we've seen versions of that in our own world, let's say with the Stoneman Douglas shooting, right? And the profiles that have been done of family and friends or even of the surviving members of the school, right? So Alfonso Jones does a literary version of that, also with visuals that talks about sort of the cost of these killings in our communities from a variety of perspectives. Alfonso even sees the man who murders him and sees how he's coping with the scrutiny and the aftermath of his death. There are multiple narratives in the text, so that's a major part of it. There's also this side narrative in which Alfonso and his friends have been studying Hamlet. And so that's part of the text as well, how they sort of go on without him and understand Hamlet through the lens of his death, right? So I Am Alfonso Jones, I think, you know, because it's a graphic novel, really poignantly depicts a community in mourning, but also I hate to use the word humanize because we know that these children, these young people are human, but I think y'all know what I mean when I say humanize, right? Sort of show a really multifaceted portrayal of who this child is, right? And all of his facets. So there's lots of points of entry in our discussion questions. Like I said, like this slide, the text contextualizes and literally includes a timeline, and these folks show up as characters who meet Alfonso in the afterlife. You could talk about the graphic novels, illustrations, the connection to Hamlet. So there's lots of different ways to engage finding your voice in this text. Next slide, please. So American Street is a text about immigration. It's a text about assimilation. It's about lots of different things. And so author E.B. Zoboy is writing about a Haitian American experience that doesn't always get depicted. In this particular moment when we're talking about ICE and immigration, oftentimes we're talking about immigrants from Latin America, Central and South America, and Mexico, which should be, those stories should be lifted up for sure, but they're also immigrants who are experiencing or part of the immigration fight who are from the larger Caribbean or the African continent or different parts of the world, parts of Asia, whose stories are not necessarily been amplified. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of two young people who are in the sort of foreground, and in the background, we can see many other young people who are sleeping under those foil blankets that people are given in detention centers. And so I include this picture because the detention center is actually a really important site in American Street, I'm sorry. So Fabiola is our protagonist, and she is an American citizen who's born in the United States, but she's raised in Haiti. And her mother and her travel to the United States, and she goes through customs just fine because she's an American citizen. But her mother, who is not, who has a traveling visa, is detained, and she's detained for several months. And so Fabiola goes on to Detroit with her Haitian American family and has to deal with assimilating into high school, dating, taking classes, dealing with being an immigrant kid, a foreign student, in quotations, and also missing her mom who's being detained and sending her these letters. So there's an epistolary element to this text as well. The other cool thing about American Street is that almost every character, including the house, get to discuss from their point of view. They get to narrate what's going on. So that's really cool. So there's lots of points of entry for discussion in American Street as well. Let's go to the next slide. So finding your voices. Next text The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, which is one of my favorite books that I hand out to people. It is a novel written in verse. And in this quote, you can see that author Elizabeth Acevedo is talking about how she wrote poems in what order. And so she actually writes one of the last poems first, right? And that sort of sets the tone for her as a writer. And so our protagonist is Xiomara. She is a young Dominican-American, Afro-Latinx young woman who is dealing with finding her voice literally through verse, through poetry. She has super strict parents. She's Catholic. She's sort of questioning her religion. She is having a really hard time moving through the world because she is leaving her house and being objectified. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a picture from the street harassment art project that I was telling y'all about previously, where it's sort of, this phrase really could be something that Xiomara says, because she is rejecting sort of the male gaze that would reduce her to a sexual object. She's not uncomfortable in her body until folks try to reduce her to a sexual object. So that's something that she is writing about in her poetry and trying to figure out through her friendships and through her relationship with her parents. So there's lots of different points of entry. You could talk about the Me Too movement, talk about poetry as this is a novel in verse. There could be a intersectional conversation, I mean, obviously on anything, but on the intersections of racism, classism, sexism in her life. There's many points of entry in this text that make it really powerful. So next slide, please. This is our last text. Anger is a Gift by Mark Oshiro. I really liked, and I wanted to include this quote from Oshiro because I think it speaks to an experience that I had as well. We didn't have a school resource officer, but we had metal detectors and just lots of surveillance. And when I went to college, like Oshiro, I recognized that that was not everyone's experience of high school, that there wasn't this sort of idea that you had to be corralled and moved around and watched all the time, that there are lots of different ways to experience schooling. And so Anger is a Gift is a text that invites readers to consider if that's their experience or if that's an experience that is, foreign or unusual to them, what that might mean, right? And so it's a text about Moss Jeffries, who's a young man who is reeling from violence in his community. He's had a parent be murdered, and he's going to a school that is more like a prison or a fortress than a site of education. And so along with his friends who are queer and trans and non-binary, he himself is queer, and there's a very sweet queer romance in the text that helps to offset some of the sadder things that are happening. And they come together to fight against this schools to prison pipeline ideology that's ruling their schools. So if we go to the next slide, I'm sure we're all familiar with the notion of the school to prison pipeline, but I really liked this infographic that breaks down what are many of the things that today's students experience, or maybe some of us have experienced this as well. So prison-like environments, harsh school discipline, underinvestment, and then the pressures and uncertainty that come along with all of those things. And so this text is really about how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with that while being part of a supportive community? So Moss has his mother, he has people in his community that love him and support him. And his mother is actually the person that tells him that anger is a gift that he can use, right? And so there are lots of different points of entry in terms of the discussion around that. So I think this text could be really interesting and useful. I think next slide might be my last slide. Yeah, so this is what overall the books in this theme do. They underscore the significance of one's individual voice. They emphasize standing up for oneself, and that could mean lots of different things. It could be calling out a teacher or an adult that misjudges you, or speaking out against a larger system, right? Racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia. And finally, they all illustrate young people empowering others. So it's not just me, the protagonist, it's me and my community, and then the larger world. So that's Finding Your Voice.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Now we're going to hear from Anne Schilling. Anne is a Great Stories Club project leader, as well as a young adult librarian at the Washington County Free Library in Western Maryland. Anne is going to provide some how-to information that will help you plan a virtual book club. Anne, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. So a little over 2 years ago, I applied for my first American Library Association Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation, Great Stories Club. I am a late in life career changer entering into librarianship, and this program and these resources helped me to reach out and become a literacy champion in my community. At the very first book club, I put on my brave face and went into a hardware secure treatment center for adolescent boys. And the boys loved the books. The teaching staff loved the books. The guards loved the books. And for a whole month, everybody was just passing all the books around. Everybody was reading. So from that point forward, I continued to apply for all of the grants that I could find through the programming librarian. And I partnered with some of these agencies that you see below and with all of these themes. And my experience is that these ALA Truth, Racial Healing, Great Stories clubs create meaningful conversations, lasting community, enthusiastic readers, and active library users. So in March, when COVID-19 closed the libraries down and we were all at home, I realized that I wanted to create a virtual space to hold the book clubs. So what follows is my journey into the world of virtual book clubs. Next slide, please. So please choose the meeting format that you're most comfortable with. I'm sure, like me, you've talked with some of your colleagues and you've attended other webinars. I can tell you that here in Maryland, we are all Zooming. The schools are all Zooming, the libraries are all Zooming, but I do have colleagues in Baltimore that are having great success using Discord. But I have felt comfortable with Zoom, and don't let tech problems challenge you. Just keep practicing and steady on. There's always going to be some sort of challenge, and we can just keep learning through them. Find your partner organization. It's a great place to start, and don't worry that working with a partner is going to exclude anybody, because what happens when you finish a book club is those teens tell other teens, the nonprofit tells other nonprofits, and it just grows. Literacy grows in the community using these book clubs. Every single one of my partner organizations has invited me back to facilitate another book club. Next slide, please. When you find your partner organization, find within that organization another adult who loves to read and can help you build a relationship with the teens at the very start. Sometimes this may be a teacher, a teaching aide, a counselor, or even a parent. But this partner, someone who is fond of teens and loves to read, is an important part of the program. And then with virtual book clubs, it's really great if you can have a tech partner. The very first book club I tried, there were several participants registered, and the Zoom room opened up and there was just one person sitting there. So I had to tap out real quick and, tap some people on Instagram, make some phone calls, send some emails, and all of the participants were there. They wanted to participate. They just sort of were like in a pandemic time warp where they were like, oh, I didn't realize it was 3 o'clock and time to start. So I have learned that if you have somebody else that can help you at the beginning of the meeting, someone who can either reach out to people to see if they're going to log in, help you log in, help anyone who's having trouble log in, then you don't have to step out of the room to take care of those things. Tech partners. Next slide, please. Okay, so select your partner organization. Together, select your theme, and then read everything from the page that Laney showed you, from the ALA Great Stories Club resources. So you do not have to prepare to teach or facilitate. You have only to guide the conversation, because all of the work has already been done for you. The words, the themes, the stories, the discussions, they are all laid out for you to build a community of readers and journey through the themes together. Make sure that the books you choose are available in both print and e-resource form. And it's even better if you can secure some money through humanities councils or library groups so that the participants can actually keep the books and begin to build their own personal reading libraries. Next slide, please. So one of my patrons and participant of a Truth Racial Healing Great Stories Club said to me, Miss Ann, you are our librarian and we trust you. We need you to give us the baseline information so that we can enter the public conversation intelligently and continue to grow. And her comment really has stayed with me, and I try very hard to do that. But what I want all of you to know is that the ALA Truth Racial Healing Transformation Great Stories Clubs, they did this for me. They gave me the information, the language, and the stories to enter conversations about race intelligently and to continue to grow. And helped me to become a strong leader in the community. I start every single club with this mission statement from the Kellogg Foundation, and I start it with vocabulary. What does it mean to jettison something? What is hierarchy of human value? The myth of a hierarchy of human value. We all have value. Find your voice, share your story matters. And I start with vocabulary. Earlier in July, I had an anti-racist book club, and I used Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And with that book club, we explored, assimilationist, segregationist, and anti-racist. And allow me to add that that book fits very well under the Deeper Than Our Skins umbrella of the previous session of these Great Stories clubs. Next slide, please. So the next two slides are things that I have learned from experiences and changes that I have made moving forward. The first one is to plan well in advance. So let's say I might have planned 3 weeks in advance for a book club, should have been 6. And I send my messages out through the library webpage, through social media, through personal invitation, through my partner organization. But all of these messages have to get through to people virtually since we're not seeing each other face to face. And I have found that that takes some time. I have to leave time for participants to schedule their curbside pickup and time for them to begin reading their materials or for the e-resources to arrive. So I have learned to contact patrons frequently. I contact them when they register. I contact them each week. I usually send out a reminder the day before and the hour before a program. May sound like a lot, but that's what's working for me. And regarding consistency and momentum, when I first started 2 of my book clubs, there was just 1 person in one and 3 people in another. 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by. But then by the 3rd week, things started to pick up, and today I have 5 patrons in one book club and 9 in another. So that consistency will build momentum. Next slide, please. So best practices say set expectations and put them on a PowerPoint, share them on the screen, put up something so that you don't have to look to each other, at each other all the time, read your expectations together. Let the teens know if you're recording. Do not expect the patrons to have read the book or have read the book to the same part. So I always plan some reading together that will lead to a discussion question. This club introduces themes and stories and conversations that are very thoughtful. And I think the most important thing I've learned is that silence is necessary because it allows participants to process their thoughts and find their voices and share their stories. And it can be uncomfortable, but my experience is that silence will lead to a statement, an idea, a story of profound insight, and it just takes some time to articulate. Silence is essential. I attended the first one of the workshops in June, and there I learned to offer to stay after, and I have put that into practice. At the end of a book club, I say, hey, I'll stay 5 or 10 minutes if anybody else wants to stay and have further conversation. And every time I make that offer, 1 or 2 patrons will decide to stay, not for very long, but just to have a little bit of a follow-up conversation. Last slide. And always end with, what are your next great reads going to be? I always send out a little evaluation on Google Slides, and I talk about what's coming up. So for me, I hope to connect with a library media specialist or a teacher in Maryland and have something over the lunchtime hour perhaps, and maybe connect with an after-school program, maybe Boys and Girls Club or something as such, so that I can maybe do virtual book clubs after school as well. I highly recommend these wonderful resources. And yeah, if you guys have any ideas in chat, please add them there too, so we can learn from each other. But it has been an honor to be with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. That concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. Before we move to Q&A, I want to thank Susanna so much for taking the time to be with us today and for all of her awesome work as part of the Great Stories Club team. And thank Anne for the wonderful work that she has done leading Great Stories Club programs in her community and for being willing to share her experiences, ideas, and advice today. Thank you, Susanna and Anne. And thank you to Brian, who's been running tech in the background for us this whole time. We have about 10 minutes that our presenters have kindly agreed to stick around for Q&A. If you have questions, please send them along. We'll prioritize questions, of course, for Suzanne and Anne since they're here. And I just want to invite everyone to reach out to us in the Public Programs Office using the email on the screen if questions come to mind after the presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We have a question here, which is for Anne. Anne, have you considered Hoopla for your book club selections?
Do you mean finding the materials on Hoopla or using Hoopla as a platform? Because I didn't. At our library, Hoopla is where you can get the resources from, like Hoopla, Libby, Overdrive. So yes, resources in e-form. And if it's a platform, that is something I did not know and we'll have to look into. I saw Boston, a library in Boston used Facebook Live for their book club. And I was curious how that went. I might look into that too.
And that question was from Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth. Another question from Emily, a general question. Can either of you suggest any sensitivity or safe space training resources?
I learned a lot from the Kellogg website, reading everything on the Kellogg website, watching a video that they have in their resource guide as far as creating a space where people can be heard.
I can share that we have on the webpage for this theme, we have some other resources. I don't think this is directly addressing your question, but we have an archive of a webinar that we offered to the library project directors that was really just about implicit bias and microaggressions, and understanding that a little bit better as sort of pre-work to convening these conversations. And there are also some resources that I believe are on the website that are really just about setting group rules, ground rules for conversation that you can use as a starting point to then get feedback from your group and make sure that everybody is comfortable in the space before you engage in conversation. So those might be of use.
There is a sheet that the racial healing practitioners use before they do a healing circle. And I believe that's on the website. And it's about 10 expectations, but it is excellent, like to go through and, you know, be open to difference, listen without judgment. It has those kind of comments on and talk about. I've learned a lot from that.
That's called the touchstones, and we'll be sure to hang that up with the archive and the slides from today. The objective of those touchstones is to establish what the Kellogg Foundation refers to as a compassionate space, and we found it really useful.
Yes.
We have a question from Anita. Anita writes, I am in a very rural white community. Do you have any experience or know of anyone who has run this kind of book club in this situation? If so, how was it received, or is there any difference in how to choose books?
I'll say over the years of working with librarians, I've had librarians tell me that they've used the books in all different kinds of scenarios. And they'll be like, oh, I was really afraid in my community to read X, Y, Z. And people have had all kinds of experiences, generally positive. I think that what I found, and Anne, you can chime in and, you know, share your experience, but what I find is sometimes genre is more of an issue, right? Like sometimes students will be like, oh, I really don't like sci-fi, or I'm not into, you know, realistic narratives or things like that, or I don't like comic books, or I don't like graphic novels. Those are the complaints I've heard more of, rather than, you know, this hasn't worked. I feel like generally patrons who are coming to this kind of book club sometimes are self-selecting, but that may be my experience just hearing it on the other side. So,
and Washington County is rural and predominantly white community, and I think I have just kind of taken a deep breath. My anti-racist book club was fairly mixed, but what I found is if you set it up, read the story together and discuss those questions and leave the space for conversation, like all of those things put together equals kids who just love the books by the end of it and love that they've shared the conversation together and they form this community based on these conversations. Kids who didn't even know each other before, right? They form and then they form the relationship with you too, so then they come see you at the library. That's been my experience, and I've been doing this around the year for 2 years now, and it's worked every single time.
Thanks, Anne. I think that is the last question. Oops, another one from Sherry. Hi, Sherry. For Anne, how did you access your racial healing partner? And how much did they charge? And how many racial healing circles did they facilitate?
I've had 2 racial healing practitioner circles, and I just sort of had to, I had to call Lanny and Brian, and they had to give me lists, and then I made my calls and kind of hunted people down a little bit, but both the healing circles were just amazing. Each practitioner, my practitioner's fee was $1,000. And then I used some extra money for food to set up some shared meal during that time as well. So it ended up being around like $1,200 for the whole event, which lasted about 2 hours. And the one healing circle was in the Hardware Secure Treatment Center, which is the highest level of care in the state of Maryland for adolescents. And the guards told me later that they had never seen the group, which was about 15 boys, so intent on what was being said and what was being shared for that length of time. So I thought that was really powerful feedback. And then the other racial healing circle was in a public high school, and it was beautiful. And some of the kids invited some of their teachers to come, and I thought that was wonderful as well.
I can add that the fees that we have been privy to for folks who are directly affiliated, consultants essentially to the Kellogg Foundation, or folks who've had really in-depth training from the foundation, those circles do start at about $1,000 for the practitioners to come in and do this work. I can also ask Sherry if you are interested in connecting with someone to send an email to public programs. ALA, with support from Kellogg, trained a cohort of 40 librarians. So those folks are, you know, kind of fledgling circle facilitators, but they've had the right preparation and they're looking for opportunities to sort of build their practice. We have some exciting new work that has happened essentially in response to the situation with both COVID and the entire national reaction in the wake of George Floyd's murder, where some of the circle work has been brought into virtual spaces. So if you are looking to be matched with someone who might be able to work with your community, send us an email and we'll try to be helpful to you. There's a question from Kim. Where do I find the Kellogg Foundation statement that Anne mentioned? I think you're talking about the touchstones. We'll send out a message later today with a link to where the archived content from this webinar lives, and we'll include that file. That statement is called the touchstones.
And the mission is on healourcommunities.org.
Okay, well, I think we've gotten to all the questions. I'm just double checking. All right, well, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much, Susanna. Everyone else, thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in these materials. I hope that they're helpful to you in the work that you do in your libraries. Please keep an eye out for an email from the Public Programs Office later this afternoon or maybe in the morning. If you have a few minutes to take the survey, it would be helpful to us in learning from your experience and improving what we do in the future. And please contact us if we can help. Thank you to all.